Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. In this week's episode, we interview Desun Oka about his digital exhibit for the California State Railroad Museum about the White Train Movement, a movement about nuclear disarmament in the Cold War era. It's a story we're very excited to share on this platform. If you'd like to learn more about the White Train Movement, we do have that digital exhibit. The link is in the description below. And with that, we'll jump right into the interview. Thank you so much for listening. All right, hello everybody, and welcome to Roundhouse Crosstalk. I'm here today with Desun Oka, the maker of one of our digital exhibits up on our website called White Trains. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe we can jump into the first question. So your work focuses on the protests surrounding shipments of Trident missiles during the Cold War via railroads. So can you start by just sort of telling us a little bit about what Trident missiles were and what logistical problems was the U.S. Army facing regarding these missiles?
Yeah, so Trident missiles are well, at the time, they were a recent development by the U.S. military that allowed submarines to carry nuclear warheads, several nuclear warheads in one missile. So the logistical problem was, first of all, they were very dangerous, so they needed to find a safe way to transport them, and they needed to find a way to load them into the submarines. So you had a situation where a lot of the factories that built the Trident missiles were located like way inland in like Texas in particular. So the U.S. government had to find a way to transport those missiles to the submarine bases, and they contracted the Department of Energy to basically train these or load these missiles onto the trains, bring them to Bangor Naval Base in Seattle, and then load them into the submarines there.
And that Bangor Naval Station in Washington State already had some protests surrounding it previously as well.
Yeah, so during the 70s, a lot of anti-nuclear activists, nuclear disarmament activists, were already protesting the base there, as like a part of the larger anti-war movement. It was only, so they started in the 1970s, and it was only in the early 80s that they noticed kind of these mysterious unmarked trains coming in. And, this exhibit talks about how they realized that, okay, these unmarked trains are coming in at a certain regular interval. Where are they coming from? And they were able to trace these trains back to the factories that built the Trident missiles.
And how do they do that? Was it just sort of looking at the logs, or?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the Jim Douglas, who's the main guy in the story of the White Train here, he and his wife Shelley Douglas kind of noticed these trains coming in on regular intervals, and they traced these trains back. They had they kind of asked their networks, their peers, their activist friends and families across the country to say, okay, this train is coming at this time. Do you see the same unmarked white train coming in at wherever you're at? So there's a lot of so they use a lot of like backtracking and guesswork, and eventually traced it back to a factory in Texas. And this Texas factory was known to actually build those Trident missiles.
So it sounds like a very grassroots type thing.
Yeah, exactly. So once they found out that the Department of Energy was transporting these missiles from Texas to Washington, they really organized a bunch of volunteers across the country, especially volunteers who lived along the railway tracks to like keep track of when the trains will be arriving and departing from their towns. And they would log those into the books, and they would call Shelley and Jim in Seattle and said, okay, this train arrived in my town, so-and-so. I expected to get to Seattle in so-and-so time. And so with that information, they were able to plan ahead and literally sit in front of the tracks leading into Bangor Naval Base.
And so Shelley and Jim Douglas are sort of the people sort of organizing that. And that's the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action that you talked about. That's their organization. So you talk about doing sit-ins to prevent those trains from passing. What was sort of the response to those sit-ins?
Yeah, so the response, it was a wide range of response within the community. You had some community folks in Seattle and Washington really supporting this movement and saying, you're doing a good job. Like, this is what's keeping us from literally like the brink of nuclear war. Others were like more critical and vitriol in their reaction, and they said these two are traitors. Like they shouldn't be doing this. Like this is for national security. There were other responses that were also more nuanced and complicated too. That said, I work in the naval bases, and I actually do support what you're doing, but you have to realize that this is a national security issue, and that if we don't have nuclear bombs or nuclear missiles and submarines, then the Soviet Union will. And what we're doing is really just self-defense. And they spoke. A lot of them did speak in some respect, like with some respect towards the Douglases and Ground Zero, but a lot of them those same people also kind of dismissed them as idealistic.
Yeah, and I mean that just sounds like it's a very complicated problem, right? Because they're claiming this is like a self-defense thing, but clearly it's not how Jim and Shelley
Exactly. Yeah, Jim and Shelley, they kind of responded to that critique as well, and they said, no, it's not just self-defense. America is, or the United States is an aggressor in the Cold War as well in many parts of the world, and they use nuclear weapons to project like aggressively their kind of imperial power. So that was one reason too. And another was even though the Soviet Union is also problematic as well, they kind of misuse and develop and threaten the world with their own nuclear missiles. They said that's just gives us a more reason to work with like anti-nuclear activists in the Soviet Union and across the world to really denuclearize the world.
So they sort of saw their allies as other anti-nuclear activists rather than just the country they happen to be in.
Exactly, yeah. So they really viewed this as a worldwide issue, and throughout the years of their White Train protest, they brought in speakers, like religious and activist speakers from Japan. Some of them managed to bring in speakers from like certain Soviet states, some from Europe. Yeah.
So I guess the most common protest, it sounds like, because they find out when this train's going to arrive. They sit on the tracks, force the train to stop.
Yeah.
What is sort of the law enforcement reaction to that?
Right. So when they did the sit-ins, and then when the trains met the protesters, the trains and the operators like called the local police, and the local police was usually more than happy to actually arrest these protesters. So whether that's the city or county, law enforcement in that area of Washington. But what was interesting is actually the court cases that followed their arrest. So there was this one case where 19 of them got charged for trespass, not just trespassing, but like property violation and like destroying like federal property. What was interesting about this case is that the judge here actually dismissed the case, and the lead prosecutor kind of explained to one of the papers, and you're going to see this in the exhibit, that said, okay, why did the judge overturn this case? And implied in that, this lead prosecutor kind of implied that, okay, maybe that they didn't want to really get this case out of control and into the public limelight. And he was worried he kind of speculated that the judge just didn't want to make martyrs out of these like 19 protesters who were being charged. So I think they were careful of like public reception to these protesters because they did receive support across the country. And if the trial was to get bigger, then the entire anti-nuclear the nuclear disarmament movement would get too much attention in the public.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It's sort of like if the sitting on the tracks doesn't actually prevent the Trident missiles from eventually getting to their place, it's more of like a publicity thing to try to get their message out.
Exactly.
So then they're sort of reacting of like, okay, we're going to downplay this as much as possible.
Right, exactly. And I think one of the biggest lessons of this entire episode was that like social movement tactics are not just about literally stopping the trains coming in or the police cars to pull up or a raid to happen. It's to bring attention. And I think, bring the media there and have the entire nation see the issue at hand and that there is a crisis. And I think this is true for literally all social movements, like sitting in the freeways, stopping a bridge, or chaining themselves to a conference door, or et cetera, et cetera. The conference is still going to happen, the laws are still going to get passed, the missiles are still going to get delivered, but the outcome is that people are not paying attention.
Yeah. And it sounds like, so they were involved in the anti-war stuff in the past, so it sounds like they're sort of using that experience now with these missiles.
Exactly. So it's like in the early 70s, they were very much involved in the anti-war movement, and then they found the white train crisis kind of came rolling in, and they really just diverted their energy into stopping the white trains.
So something your exhibit talks a little bit about as well is the role of religion in Shelley and Jim's determination for this. So what was that about?
Yeah, so Jim studied in Santa Clara University and really embraced the ideas of like Catholic liberation or liberation theology. And for him, stopping the trains was really like an act of like love and grace towards humanity. And he would constantly cite like the teaching, like Jesus Christ and Christianity, the ideas of agape, Christian love, to say that these nuclear weapons are really like an affront to like God and spirituality. So in all the propaganda and publications that Ground Zero put out, a lot of the ones that were published by Jim always referenced spirituality and God, and said that as a good Christian, we actually have to do what we need to do to stop these trains. And one really interesting outcome of like connecting the movement to spirituality and religion was that he managed to convince one of the potential jurors in the trial that was trying to persecute the 19 who got arrested, and he managed to convince one of the jurors to like change her mind. She was at first vehemently opposed to these protests, but then she realized that okay, these protesters are actually Christian, or like these protesters really are committed to like Christian values. And she says, okay, I realized like as a Christian woman, she called herself, I'm a like very mainline Christian, middle class, conservative woman from the suburbs. And then she says, you know what? And then she's like, okay, these are Christians, and the right Christian thing to do is to resist and not stand by. So it was a pretty remarkable change how she went from a conservative Republican suburban Christian to a resistor, or like someone who actually supported the movement.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, within the court case too, because that doesn't seem like generally the place that people change their mind. They're being presented to, these people have committed crime. You'd think they'd be sort of preempted to judge those folks.
Yeah, exactly. And if we have that one case, then it's probably no surprise that a lot of government officials and members in the judicial courts were kind of worried that, okay, if this one person can change their mind, then other people across the world and the country can change their mind too.
Yeah. So how did this protest movement end?
Yeah, so eventually the Department of Energy just shifted to trucks, and they were able to bring in the missiles through trucks on a timetable that wasn't set. So ultimately, the white train movement didn't stop nuclear armaments, or it didn't disarm the world of nuclear weapons, but it did bring critical attention to the issue, and yeah, that's basically it.
So after this shift from the railroad to these trucks, actually, I guess expanding on that, is there any sense that because of the white train movement, they wanted to shift towards trucks? Or was that just something like a technological progress thing?
So I should probably elaborate. It wasn't just for public attention that they, generated. They actually did make the Department of Energy worry. And I think one of the Department of Energy officials, like in his note, referred to the white trains as death trains. So, reading between the lines and kind of making educated guesses, I think the shift to trucks was very much in part due to the white trains movement.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense if you're having all this sort of protest, and the way that these people are being able to communicate and set up these protests is entirely because the trains have to talk to each other, and it goes on this one singular path.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really predictable.
Yeah, and I think another thing is that the Bangor Naval Base is not just the only naval base that loaded Trident missiles. There's one on the East Coast, I believe is Georgia, or one of the southern states that has like Trident loading bases, and the factory, the Pantex factory in Texas, would also ship Trident's missiles eastward. So Jim and Shelley Douglas actually moved to the south after the white train movement to kind of generate awareness of the white trains over there and the route that the trains took over there, and to participate in the civil rights movements of the 80s and 90s.
So that's really interesting. So I guess once they shift to the trucks instead of the trains, Shelly and Jim don't just give up on the project.
Yeah,
They move down and say, okay, well, we can't track your trains anymore, but we do know where your factory is, and you're not going to be able to move that.
Exactly. Yeah. So they literally moved to the south, and the Ground Zero movement. Actually, they still continue to produce materials and publications in Seattle, and they're actually still active to this day.
That's interesting. So what do they focus on? Is it still nuclear disarmament? Have they branched out?
They focus on like the broader social justice movements in the United States. I think in the 80s, it was the nuclear disarmament movement. I think in the 90s and 2000s, they focused on the war in Iraq. That was another big thing that published a lot of material through Ground Zero. That Ground Zero published. Black Lives Matter movements of the 2018, and they also have commented on the war in Ukraine as well, like most recently. So they've been publishing as late as this year.
Wow. And I'm assuming just based on ages, it's probably not still run by Shelly and Jim.
Yeah. I think a couple of their friends are still involved, but it's likely they pass the baton down to the younger generations.
So what do you, I guess, hope that people take away from the exhibit as a whole in this story?
Yeah, so this exhibit, I hope, teaches people the power of social movements. Social movements can make a difference in actually like broader like national and international politics. And I think one of the arguments that Jim and Shelley Douglas and the Ground Zero organization said that our movement in the United States inspired and encouraged the anti-disarmament movement around the world, including activists in the Soviet Union. So they're really like challenging this idea that there's like zero-sum game that's like that the world politics is some like geopolitical like chess piece or chessboard where if one person doesn't have a strong military, the other person will invade and destroy ourselves. So like it's not. They're saying that like. We don't have to beef up our military and project our power just because the Soviet Union is doing it. We can find a way we can lower the temperature across the board and like lower militarism like across the board. And I think they demonstrated that by with their activism. Like at the end of the day, this one journalist actually remarked that it was because of the nuclear disarmament movement that we did not have a nuclear apocalypse.
Oh, wow.
Really. So, I think that's kind of like one of the big takeaways.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a huge takeaway.
Yeah.
So I guess, and this might not be something you've had a chance to research because this did come out of a 16-week course originally. I guess, like, have you done any research to see to what extent the Soviets talked about this movement or anything like that, or is it?
I didn't see any commentary from like Soviet officials. They did invite, or they wrote letters and invited a Soviet anti-nuclear activist too. And they worked with him and advised him on their activism. So I think that's like another kind of like a potential sequel to this project is like the communication between them and the activists in the Soviet Union at a time when in the 80s is like it was way worse than the 70s. It was like people were actually worried that there was going to be like a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure they use similar tactics, just thinking about it. I'm sure they use railroads and things like that.
And so I think, if anyone was to continue this project, or if I was to continue this project, it would be to look at how the U.S. government responded to the anti-nuclear or the nuclear disarmament movement and the white train movement and how they changed policy as a result. I think there were some government officials who kind of like denied that the movement actually like really impacted, like the denuclearization of the United States, and they said, oh no, it was a broader political kind of reason to why they denuclearized a little bit in the 80s and 90s. But some government officials also have said, but it was actually because of the movement. And the movement was right in that things aren't zero sum, that just because the United States disarmed, that doesn't mean the Soviet Union will necessarily take advantage of that disarmament. There's going to be forces within government and society that will also pressure their governments in the Soviet Union to disarm as well. So that's interesting. Like it kind of challenges the notion that with one decrease, the rival power will increase their power. You can actually have a situation where if we pressure our governments to restrain, then there's forces and there's forces, peoples and politicians in the other state that will also try to restrain their power as well.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense, right? If you see the other side continually ramping up, you're not going to decrease your military,
Exactly,
or you're not even going to
exactly.
stay the same level.
Exactly,
You're going to increase that as well.
Exactly, yeah.
And then the reverse is also true. If they're willing to say, hey,
Exactly, yeah.
I'll get rid of some of my nukes, you get rid of some of yours, it's easier to have that sort of common ground.
Exactly, yeah. And I think, the white train movement demonstrated that, and I think, and this is another potential research path, is that they probably leverage their own sympathetic politicians in definitely local governments, actually local representatives and local governments have spoken in favor of the white train movement, but I'm sure maybe they had allies in the federal government too, where they, they asked those politicians, their allied politicians in the federal government to say, okay, please pressure our government and signal to the Soviet Union that we're also we're really committed to denuclearization or really ramping down.
Definitely. So we mentioned it a little bit here. So this exhibit came out of a what is it called? It's college course. That's what the word is, kind of. With the museum's director about railroads, creating digital exhibits, things like that. So I guess what got you interested in the subject? Was this something you already knew about?
Yeah, in the beginning of the course, they asked us, hey, find a subject that you're interested in. And I think I was interested in social movement history, and I just typed in railroads and social movement history. And I found this one article on the history.com that talked about the white train history. And I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. No one wrote about this, and I couldn't really find any academic articles or history journal articles about this issue. I was like, okay, there's not a lot of research on this. So, and then I kind of mulled over it a little bit, and then I think one day Kim or Ty talked about oh, you could you could search for archives. And so what I did was I searched for specific archives, and I typed in white trains in some archives search database, and then I found out there's a Ground Zero archive in University of Washington. And so I had friends there, and I was planning to visit. So I was okay, I can devote 2 days to looking through this archive when I visit my friends in Seattle, and I did. And it was this treasure trove of propaganda material, diary entries, logs, newspapers in black and white and color of the time, early 90s. There was a lot of really moving and compelling pictures of people sitting in front of trains or trains about to hit people. That just made it kind of perfect for a digital exhibit, So, that's basically how I found out. I was interested in social movement and railroad history, but I learned how to search for archives themselves, and I found this just Ground Zero archive that I'm sure Ground Zero donated probably 10 years ago for safekeeping at the University of Washington.
Definitely, and I think, as you said, the pictures just really are so unique and interesting with this movement that they work perfectly for digital exhibit.
Yeah. So it was a challenge in that this exhibit it didn't really rely on. I didn't have a lot of secondary sources. There was a history.com article, and then there was a couple publications that Ground Zero themselves did, and Jim Shelley did, but not a lot of like history journal articles. None of them actually explicitly cited there's an archive in University of Washington. No, it was like this search engine, probably Archives Grid or something, that kind of popped up the search results when I typed in white trains. It was like, okay, there's a Ground Zero archive in University of Washington. I was like, okay, I'll just go.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, yeah, thank you.
Great, and if anyone's interested in learning more about the white trains, we do have that digital exhibit available now on our website. The link is in the description. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. If you'd like to learn more about the white train movement, please visit our digital exhibit. The link is in the description below. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.